Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Every year on the 26th of January, India celebrates its Republic Day. The occasion is marked by a grand parade at the Kartavya Path in New Delhi. A parade which is meant to showcase India's cultural diversity, military strength, and technological advancements. The national flag is hoisted in schools, government institutions, and local communities. And much like Independence Day, streets are often lined with the tricolors. But what this day is meant to commemorate, of course, is the adoption of the Constitution of India and the country's transition to a republic which came into effect on 26 January 1950. So today, we are dedicating this episode to the Constitution by looking at three key debates that were fiercely argued by our founding fathers during its creation. And to do this, we are joined by the Indian Express's Adrija Roy Chaudhary. Adrija, can you first tell us how long it actually took the Constituent Assembly to finalize what became the Indian Constitution?
So, it almost took 3 years to draft the constitution. And to be precise, it was like 2 years, 11 months and 17 days. And we know that the Constituent Assembly, it was formed by elected members of the provincial assemblies. And the first meeting was held on 9th of December, 1946. And then the constitution was drafted over a course of, say, around 11 sessions, and it lasted about 165 days. And then the first draft was submitted by the chairman, B.R. Ambedkar, on February 1948. Finally, the constitution was adopted on 26th of November 1949, and it came into effect on 26 January 1950.
So we understand that there were almost 300 members that were part of this Constituent Assembly. And you mentioned how it took about 3 years for the Constitution to come into effect. Could you give a sense of just how heated some of these debates got between these members?
See, much of what we know about the Constituent Assembly debates is, what we have recorded in terms of the text of these debates. Okay, but what I understand is that some issues, they were debated in quite ferociously with a lot of views coming in from different perspectives. For instance, the issue of language, whether Hindi or Hindustani or English ought to be the official language, that was debated quite fiercely for a while. Then minorities and reservations, again, it was quite an extensive debate that went on with, multiple perspectives coming in. And then I also came across this nugget of information just today on how the name of the country, that was also debated, because somebody suggested that the name should be changed to Aryavarta, is what I understand. And then that was opposed quite vigorously by the other members. So yeah, there were issues on which there were, sometimes these debates would go on for days also, like in terms of in some of these finer details of what we know about India today, they were being debated very precisely, very minutely by these different, almost 300 members of the Constituent Assembly.
Right, and today we are focusing on three of these debates, and the three that we have picked are all very contentious, even today. And we'll begin by the term secular, which over the past few years has generated a lot of debate. And this is a term that features quite prominently in the preamble. Can you tell us how that came about and how it was first introduced?
It's quite interesting that the word secular, it was not even there in the original preamble. It's only much later in 1976 that it was incorporated into the preamble. So the original preamble, it used the phrase, "We the people of India having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign democratic republic." The words secular and socialist, they were incorporated through the 42nd Amendment of the Constitution, which happened during the emergency that was declared by Indira Gandhi. And this was done to spell out expressly the ideals of secularism and socialism in the nation. Now, we must remember that during the 42nd Amendment, Indira Gandhi's government had actually made several sweeping changes in the constitution. And almost every part of the constitution was amended, and these were done so as to expand the powers of the center and curb any kind of opposition. Later, once the emergency was lifted, the Supreme Court had actually struck down most of these changes. But it retained the words secularism and socialism because they were in any case known to be part of the spirit of India.
Right, and it is surprising that these two terms that we associate with our founding fathers actually came about much later. And, there are critics of the term secular who say that, this is a foreign concept and that there is an inherent foreignness to it. So, can you talk about how this concept was viewed by our founding fathers?
So actually it was Professor K.T. Shah, who was this economist and lawyer and member of the Constituent Assembly from Bihar. He was the first person to suggest that the preamble should contain the word secular. So clearly it was discussed even during the Constituent Assembly debates, even though finally in the original document it was not incorporated. And in the next few days, as the Assembly debated upon it, and there was an absolute consensus on the fact that in spirit, India would be a secular country. But then the word was not to be applied to the constitution. And the reason for that was, we must remember that the word secularism, it originates in Europe. And there it was the product of the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment. And typically it meant that the state shall have no involvement in religious matters. So you will see in France, even today, the concept of secularism is invoked to speak out against religious symbols in public, such as the hijab. And the founding fathers, they were very concerned about this very European understanding of the term and whether it can be applied to the Indian socio-cultural context, especially because, it would immediately clash with, say, minority rights, which again was something that had to be incorporated in the constitution.
Right, and in that sense, the European version of secularism actually means kind of the exclusion of all religions, whereas in India, we take secularism to mean the inclusion of all religions.
Exactly. In the Indian context, the whole idea of secularism meant that we must allow every person to express themselves religiously as they desire to, and the state shall not promote or curb any one particular religion.
It's funny that the term secular was included in the preamble because of Indira Gandhi, because we associate it so much with Nehru, right? He was a major proponent of it. He wanted India to be secular. But is the European context the reason why he opposed its inclusion in the constitution?
It is actually ironical because Nehru is known to be one of the staunchest supporter of the principle of secularism. And he, along with Ambedkar, they were both very staunchly opposed to the inclusion of secularism in the preamble. Nehru viewed secularism, more as a functional concept rather than a rigid institutional kind, which is why he did not use the term in the constitution. He was aware that this is a European model and could not be applied to India. And in the assembly debates on several occasions, his ideas on the separation of state and religion, they were very clear. Like, I'll quote one such instance when he pointed out that we must have it clearly in our minds and in the minds of the country that the alliances of religion and politics in the shape of communalism are a most dangerous alliance and they yield the most abnormal kind of illegitimate brood. So he was clearly very much opposed to the intermingling of state and religion. But instead of using this term explicitly, he sort of established a flexible framework that upheld the spirit of secularism. For instance, in our constitution, we have aspects like establishing no state religion, extending citizenship to all, guaranteeing quality of status and opportunity. So these were ways in which he modified the whole idea of secularism to suit the Indian context.
By the way, you mentioned that Ambedkar was also opposed to this idea. Can you tell us what were his reservations about this?
So Ambedkar he also wanted to avoid including the term secularism, and he had said this, that what should be the policy of the state and how the society should be organized in its social and economic side these are matters on which the people must decide themselves according to time and circumstances. So he basically laid it open for the country to decide upon as time went and in their own context as India would grow. And so he did not want it explicitly to be laid down in the constitution of itself. And he said this, and I'm quoting him, that it would destroy democracy altogether. So, which is why, the term was not used, but several other things like incorporating equality and ensuring that all citizens have equal opportunities and things like that. These things ensured that the document in spirit was secular, but does not use the word explicitly.
And speaking of equal opportunity, let's move on to our next debate. Now, we know that the discussion over the rights of minorities featured very prominently in the Constituent Assembly. And this is an issue that continues to be under debate. Could you tell us what were the initial discussions regarding who should be considered a minority when it came to safeguarding their rights?
One thing is that before they even finalize the provisions of protection of minorities, like you said, the Constituent Assembly, they spent a lot of time discussing and deliberating upon who are the minorities of India. We take this so much for granted as to who the minorities are, but there was a lot of discussion in terms of who are the communities that we designate as minorities. And they're quite interesting because these debates were revealing in terms of how different members of the assembly, they viewed, say, ideas of democracy very differently, or how, even people belonging to the same religion, there was such large differences among them in terms of social, economic, and cultural aspects. And each these things were determining how they saw themselves, whether they saw themselves as a minority or not. So, for instance, N.G. Ranga, who was this farmers' leader, he thought of minorities not in terms of their numerical strength, but rather as a group that suffered from some kind of mistreatment from the rest of the society. And so they needed protection from the state.
So communities which were oppressed, essentially.
Exactly. So in his head, minority is not someone who's less in numbers, but any community that has been oppressed over the years. Then, of course, there were members of the scheduled caste community who predictably asked the SCs to be classified as minorities, to which K.M. Munshi, he raised an opposition. And he said that, the international treaties, they define minorities in racial, religious and linguistic lines. And that the scheduled castes did not really fall in any of these categories. And he considered them to be part and parcel of the Hindu community. Then similar arguments about being classified as minorities were made by the tribal groups. Then there were leaders who were very wary of the fact that if the scheduled castes and tribes were all made minorities, then they would constitute about half of the population of India. So how can you have that many, like a series of minorities in independent India? So these kind of arguments were being made, and a lot of discussion on whom should be treated as a minority.
And as someone from the minority community, the Dalit community, what did Ambedkar make of these arguments?
Ambedkar, as we all know, he had for several years before the independence been working towards eradication of caste and representation of lower castes and the Dalit community. When it came to the constitution, he first clarified his position by stating that caste operates differently in different regions. So, say somebody from the Shudra community in Punjab might be treated very differently from, say, someone from the same community in Karnataka. So, first we need to determine the backwardness of a community. He introduced this term that we first need to, establish that it is backwardness that must determine whether a community can be classified as a minority or not. And for that, he left it to the state governments to determine and draw up a list of communities requiring constitutional protection. By introducing this term backwardness, it was his way of sort of reconciling these multiple positions on minorities. So basically what he was saying is that there would be no one particular group identity that the constitution would seek to protect. And then, introducing backwardness, he also ensured that caste and class sort of interacted with each other. Also, this way of looking at minorities would also resolve the question of whether reservations were for the sake of social emancipation or whether it was to highlight the diversity of India. And clearly for Ambedkar, the whole idea of reservations was that it should give some kind of social and political emancipation for the minorities, whoever was classified as a minority.
And so how did the Constituent Assembly eventually settle this issue? What did they end up deciding?
Actually, ultimately, Ambedkar's take on backward classes, it was not taken up in the constitution, mainly because many thought that backwardness was sort of open to interpretation and it had to be defined in a more clear manner. So finally, the Constituent Assembly, they granted reservations for employment to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. This is under Article 16(4)(a). And initially, reservations were constituted only for 10 years. But it kept extending ever since then. Religious minorities, including Muslims and Christians, they were not treated as minorities in the constitution, mainly due to the partition which had just sort of, I think it was still in the process. If we look at it in 46, the Constituent Assembly sits and it's literally the peak of the partition when they are still debating. So because of the partition, they decided to not include religious minorities as minorities because they thought that might encourage further separatism in the country.
Logically, it makes sense that if you're going to have a secular country with a Hindu majority because of the partition, wouldn't you want to safeguard the rights of those who are lesser in number?
That's the thing, that this entire idea of numerical strength was not completely applied to minorities in India. The whole idea of reservations was to provide justice for historical wrongs that have been done to a community.
So the idea was that even though a community might be lesser in number, if they have not been historically oppressed, then they perhaps don't require safeguarding.
Exactly. And because, the partition was a very living moment. Perhaps in 2025, it's a little hard for us to understand exactly what was happening at that moment. But for the Constituent Assembly, it was a living moment. And you're seeing violence on religious grounds happening all over you. Perhaps you would assume that, if we now go to give reservation to one particular community over here, that might just enrage feelings of communalism even more.
Okay, so we've spoken about secularism, we've spoken about protecting minorities and reservations, and now we come to the third section, which perhaps could be the most controversial one. Basically, towards the end of the Constituent Assembly's work, a rather controversial provision was added to the directive principles of state policy, which was the prohibition of the slaughter of cows and calves. And before we talk about why they ended up doing that, can you tell our listeners what exactly are directive principles?
The directive principles are basically guidelines to be followed by the government while they frame any kind of new policy or a new law. They're not exactly enforceable by the court, but they're laid down almost like, fundamental principles which should be followed while administering the country.
Right, and when we talk about the ban on the slaughter of cows, at the outset, it seems like because the cow is a sacred animal for the Hindus, this seems like a decision made by the majority and for the majority. But during that time, and you just spoke about how all this was happening while the partition was going on, could you talk about what was the political significance of the cow during that time?
See, one thing we must understand is that the cow did have a complex presence in Indian psyche historically. So there are Hindu scriptures that have mentioned devotion to the cow. And even though there is evidence to suggest that complete abstinence from beef eating did not really happen in ancient India, but there was a complicated relationship that historically Indians had with the cow. And during the freedom movement, we see that the Congress uses this imagery of the cow on several occasions, much like they would use any other religious symbols, Tilak's Ganpati or using Ram as a religious symbol to fight for nationalist rights. So throughout the freedom movement, we see leaders sort of alluding to the protection of the cow as a way to protect Mother India. So there were groups within the Congress demanding legislation banning cow slaughter. But then there were concerns about Muslim alienation as well. I'm talking during the peak of the nationalist movement. Now, after the partition and the making of Pakistan, this feeling of protecting the cow, it's sort of heightened. And now you have the Hindu right, both within the Congress and beyond. They were demanding that the cow needs to be protected. And you have the industrialist Ramakrishna Dalmia, the Dalmia group. He established the Govak Nivak Sangh, or what was the Anti-Cow Slaughter League. And it carried out this full-fledged movement for cow protection. They would arrange for sadhus to do sit-ins in front of Nehru's house. And immediately following Dalmia's petition and his movement, you have a lot of independent organizations. They're passing anti-cow killing resolutions. So clearly there was an atmosphere of petitions and demands to the political leaders and the founding fathers of India to ban cow slaughter.
Okay, so all this is happening at a time when the symbol of the cow, like you mentioned, is really intertwined with the whole nationalistic movement. So what were some of the key arguments in favor of banning cow slaughter, and who were its main supporters within the Constituent Assembly?
So one of the most, vociferous cow lobbyist, his name was Pandit Thakur Das Bhargava from East Punjab. And he was, one of the most prominent cow lobbyists in the assembly. And he argued for cow protection from an economic point of view. It's quite interesting that he would say that if we have to improve agriculture, food production and health, then how can we do that unless we curb cow slaughter? And then there was somebody called R.V. Dhulekar from the United Provinces who argued for cow protection on more religious grounds also, saying that, the cow is just like our mother. In fact, it is more like our mother. And I'll just quote this from his debate where he says that, I can declare from this platform that there are thousands of people who will not run at a man to kill that man for their mother or wife or children, but they will run at a man if that man does not want to protect the cow or wants to kill her. So there were, very emotive, very, very, sentimental debates happening over the cow.
Okay, so Nehru, like we mentioned earlier, was a big proponent of secularism. And here we are talking about such a prominent Hindu symbol and connecting it to the nationalist movement. What was his stance regarding this?
Nehru was predictably worried about these demands, and we have evidence of letters that he was writing to other members of the Constituent Assembly. For instance, he had written to the President of the Assembly, Rajendra Prasad, and he wrote to him that, India is a composite country, and if we take any such step purely on the basis of Hindu sentiment, it means that the governance of India is going to be carried out in a particular way, which we have not done so far. So clearly he was not happy about this. But finally, it was actually Rajendra Prasad who came up with a solution. And he proposed that the protection of the cow be devoted to the directive principles of state policy. Instead of making it a fundamental right of sorts, you make it more of a guiding principle. And so Article 48 was born, and because of Article 48, several state governments, they sort of immediately enacted laws prohibiting killing of cows. And it's interesting that today around 24 states in India have legislations against cow slaughter.
And Adrija, finally, as someone who has researched and written about this period, tell us what stands out to you the most about these debates.
It's just very interesting how the founding fathers had such varied understandings of what India should be. And it's only expected, given how diverse India is, that these debates would happen, because you have people representing these diverse provincial assemblies, and each of them is representing their own language, they're representing their own culture, community of sorts, and these debates are there. But it's also very interesting how they are even thinking differently in terms of, say, values of democracy, religious freedom, protection of rights of people. So one is this. The other thing is that I also found very interesting how these finer details that we take for granted today, such as, equality, secularism, how they were being debated for days. It's taken 3 years to make this document. And in these very small details, they are exactly what is building a new country. So you're basically debating what India should look like. And even till date, we feel the repercussions of each of these debates that were happening. So these Constituent Assembly debates, it's like a masterclass in political theories that build a nation.
You were listening to 3 Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.